6.2, soil. First thing we're going to talk about is something called topsoil. This is the part of soil that is on the top that is mineral and nutrient rich, so it's full of good things to grow crops. And topsoil can be renewable if you manage it properly. We'll talk more about that. I have a video that I'm going to show you, but soil erosion, when we talk about soil erosion is happening in this ecosystem. What does that mean? It's just the removal of that topsoil by wind or water. When water takes it away or wind takes that important nutrient-rich topsoil away. An example that maybe you've even heard about in history class is the Dust Bowl. That happened in the 1930s in the United States. Actually pretty traumatic, and a lot of people's lives and their way of living suffered due to that. Wind coming in and essentially poor farming practices plus the weather blew all the topsoil away. And so literally there was dust everywhere. And I'll show you a video in class. Desertification is what happened in the Great Plains in the 1930s as a result of the Dust Bowl. It's turning farmland into desert. That is what desertification is. Another term is deforestation. It's the loss of forests. Like in the rainforest, for example. Loss of forest can also have a negative effect on soil quality. Healthy forests not only provide wood, but also hold soil in place. The roots of these trees hold that soil in place, protect the quality of the water, and keep the amount of carbon dioxide at adequate numbers and levels. If you cut down a few trees, not a big deal, it should regrow fine, but if you take them all out and the roots, this is going to cause some problems to the soil and the nutrients underneath it. And it can cause soil erosion because those roots keep the soil in the ground. So, a few things that you can do to prevent soil erosion. Maybe not you, but if you have anything to do with farming. Keep roots of plants in the ground. Those roots help keep the soil in the ground. So harvest, but keep the roots in the ground. The previous year's crop. Another thing that I know I see around the Midwest, which is a good thing, is something called crop rotation. Plant soybeans one year in a field, and the next year plant corn. The next year plant soybeans. Next year plant corn. You rotate the crops you plant in the soil because different crops use different nutrients that are in the soil. Another thing you'll see is something called contour plowing. Planting your crops according to the natural grooves or the shape of the land. It helps crops not only stay where they should, but helps prevent erosion of the soil. All right, so freshwater resources. We're talking about resources in water, okay, specifically. A pollutant is a harmful material in the biosphere. Specifically, we're going to talk about pollutants in the water here. Some examples are anything from industrial or and agricultural pesticides or chemicals. Something called DDT, mercury, or just a few. And we're going to talk about this concept called biological magnification. So we'll go ahead and draw this in your notes here. This is, it looks like a pyramid like we've talked about before. So there's a base all the way up. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 levels. If you need to pause it and draw it, go ahead. And you can see how I have them labeled: water, producers, zooplankton, small fish, large fish, fish-eating birds. So essentially this is a trophic pyramid, and producers get their nutrients from the sun. And zooplankton, and the sun comes through the water, okay? Zooplankton eat the producers, small fish eat the zooplankton, large fish eat the small fish, and fish-eating birds eat the large fish. And when you magnify something, what do you do to it? You enlarge it. So we're going to be talking about the enlarging of a pollutant. This little dot represents a pollutant. So it could be something called DDT, which we'll talk a little bit more here. So what happens is when a pollutant gets into the water, okay, so I'm going to put pollutant in the water. Oh, you might think no big deal, just a little bit went in there. Let's say 1 unit of something, 1 unit, 1 part, whatever. What happens is the producers need the water. Okay, that's part of something they need. Also, they need the sun, but they need the water. And that pollutant will go into the producers, so like algae or something like that. And it won't actually be the same amount. It will be magnified in the producers. Be magnified something like 1,000 times more strongly concentrated in the producers. And then the zooplankton eat the producers, and the pollutant then goes into their body, okay? And it gets magnified again in them, and to the point of being 10,000 times as concentrated, quite a large jump. And it goes all the way up to the food chain. Small fish at the zooplankton, and that pollutant is now 100,000 times magnified. The large fish eat the small fish, and the pollutant is 1,000,000 times magnified or more concentrated. Okay. And then the fish-eating birds eat it, and guess what? Yep, 10 million times concentrated. So essentially, 1 little unit of a pollutant, like DDT, by the time a bird eats that fish up that chain, that pollutant will be 10 million times as strong or as concentrated in that bird. And that's going to have huge negative effects for that bird. Let me give you an example. I mentioned DDT. Widespread DDT use in the late 1950s. And I'll talk more about that. It's kind of interesting. Remind me if I don't. Threatened fish-eating birds like pelicans, osprey, falcons, and bald eagles. It caused females to lay eggs that had thin, fragile shells that reduced the hatching rate. So the amount of birds that survived hatching was lower. And it caused actually a drop in bird populations. Since DDT was banned in the 1970s, bird populations have recovered. Still a concern is mercury, which is also a pollutant that gets let into the water, accumulates in the bodies of certain marine fish, such as tuna and swordfish. So I've heard about tuna before. I like tuna, but that you shouldn't eat it like more than once a week for the risk of possible mercury poisoning. And it's the same idea. If you eat the tuna, which is a large fish, and this would be you, a human, you get, if that tuna had mercury in it, you're going to get that pollutant of mercury poisoning potentially in your blood at that many times magnified. So that's what biological magnification is. It's the magnification or the increased concentration of a pollutant as it goes up the food chain. And it starts by a pollutant just being released in the water. So we know a pollutant is a harmful material. There is point sources of pollution. You know exactly where the pollutant is coming from. You can point to it, say, you caused it. Okay, examples, oil spills. Spell right. Oil spills or a factory. You can see them polluting. You know that the pollution in that air in that area is from that factory. Or if there's an Exxon oil spilled, you know that they spilled it because it's obvious. You can point to that source of pollution. Non-point sources, you don't know exactly where it came from. Don't know exactly where pollutant came from. Example, oil in water after rain. You know, sometimes you see like grease and puddles, things like that. You don't know exactly where that pollutant came from. They're called non-point. You know that automobiles, different things release pollutants, cars, even homes sometimes, right? And they drain their pollutants out, but you don't know exactly, it could be accumulation of many different sources of that pollution. Those are non-point sources of pollution. And they're actually responsible for a lot of the problems because you can't pinpoint exactly where the pollution is coming from. That's the end of 6.1, 6.2.